Hi, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Mike LeCouteur. Tonight, Prime Minister Carney is heading back to D.C.
After the election, it was elbows down, and since then, he's been flying all around.
This Prime Minister is active. He's out there building export markets. He's out there building opportunities for Canadians.
Prime Minister is making another trip down south to meet with U.S. President Donald Trump. Can he afford to come back home empty-handed? In moments, we'll bring in former Canadian ambassador to the U.S., Frank McKenna. Then, can big things still get built in Canada?
Before they have done enough work to come to us, they need to meet the 5 criteria we've laid out.
Alberta and BC are facing off over a potential pipeline plan. BC says it's not really a plan, and lifting the federal tanker ban is out of the question. We'll talk to that province's Energy Minister, Adrian Dix. Then, Remembrance reversal from Veterans Affairs.
On learning that the changes could significantly disruptive to the Remembrance Day, I've instructed my department to...
We'll bring in CTV's Abigail Beeman on their government's change of course after trying to limit remembrance wreaths across this country. First, though, we start with major breaking news on the war in the Middle East this hour. Reuters is reporting that Hamas has agreed to release all remaining Israeli hostages, dead or alive. CTV's Judy Trin is following this story for us today. And Judy, what's the latest?
Okay, Mike, there is so much breaking news right now, but let me begin. First of all, this agreement comes just hours after Donald Trump tweeted an ultimatum to Hamas. He wrote on social media that an agreement must be reached by Sunday evening at 6 p.m. This is the last chance agreement. If it's not reached, he warned, all hell, like no one has seen before, will break out against Hamas. Now, just minutes ago, we have a response from Hamas that Donald Trump also posted on Truth Social, his social media platform of choice, in which he said that Hamas appreciates the Arab, Islamic, and international efforts, as well as the efforts of U.S. President Donald Trump calling for an end to this war. We want the exchange of prisoners, the immediate entry of aid, and the rejection of the occupation of the Strip, and the rejection of the displacement of the Palestinian people from it. Now, Mike, this 20-point peace plan was first put forward on Monday after U.S. President Donald Trump met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. It calls for the release of all 48 hostages, 20 of whom are believed to be alive. Hamas members must also agree to decommission their weapons and commit to peaceful coexistence. In exchange, Israel would also release nearly 2,000 Palestinian prisoners and withdraw from Gaza to be replaced by a stabilization force led by Arab nations. So that is the crux of the plan right now, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Judy, this war has increasingly isolated Israel from the global community. What international support is there for Trump's peace plan?
This war is approaching its 2-year anniversary on October 7th next week. So there is widespread support for peace, for ending this war. But this agreement is also coming after traditional allies of Israel, such as Britain, France, Australia, and Canada, decided to recognize the Palestinian state and push for a 2-state solution. That recognition took place about 2 weeks ago in the United Nations General Assembly. So under that pressure, under this context, this is what pushed Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu to come together to draft this peace proposal, which now Hamas has committed to accepting. Mike.
All right, thanks for this, Judy Trin, with the very latest on the war in the Middle East at this hour. And remind you, this is a breaking news story. CTV News will continue to bring you the very latest with every update throughout the evening. Now, back here at home, there could be some movement on U.S. tariffs. A source speaking on background to CTV News says the Canadian side is optimistic that there will be a reduction of tariffs on steel and aluminum. This comes as Prime Minister Mark Carney has announced he's heading to Washington on Monday for a meeting with President Donald Trump, and that one will happen on Tuesday. Both countries have lifted tariffs on goods covered under the North American trade deal known as CUSMA, but many tariffs still remain in place. You can see them here. Tariffs on steel and aluminum are at 50%. Copper products taxed at the same rate. Then there are some coming into effect on October 14th. Those are on softwood lumber and on some types of furniture. Now, following the announcement of Carney's trip, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre posted on social media, in part, hoping Prime Minister Carney will keep his promise and negotiate a win with President Trump to end the U.S. tariffs in their Tuesday meeting. Poilievre went on to say no word on where the Prime Minister's elbows have gone after he backed down again and again with nothing to show for it, end quote. So what does this say about the state of trade talks between the two countries, the fact that they are having another meeting? Joining us now to preview the visit is former Canadian ambassador to the United States, Frank McKenna. Welcome back to Power Play. How you doing?
Good. Thank you, Mike.
I wanted to start with that news that there's possibly some movement on the steel and aluminum tariffs. How significant is that in your opinion?
Well, if it's true, it certainly represents a breakthrough. You have to remember in context that we have the lowest tariff rates in the world at about 5%. That's because most of the products which cross the border are CUSMA compliant. The problem is that there are some exceptions which the United States have carved out that are at 50%, and that includes steel and aluminum. And for those particular industries, they're being really hard done by. But we have reason to believe that the United States is suffering as well from the steel and aluminum tariffs. In the case of aluminum, probably close to 75% of the aluminum used in the United States comes from Canada, which is really accelerating the cost for a lot of commodities within the United States and putting pressure on the government to find a compromise. So it wouldn't be surprised if there was some movement on those two commodities.
You bring up the trade deal and how we actually have a really good tariff rate, essentially, with the Americans. And that is something that this government has tried to tell that story as much as possible, despite the fact, as you rightly mentioned there, that disproportionately there are huge tariffs on other industries. How difficult is it for this government to try and tell that story when you have those industries suffering so much? And even though that the Canadian side seems to sort of sit back and say, hey, look, don't worry, we don't have that bad of a deal right now, in spite of those other sectors?
Well, media quite appropriately like to lead with more spectacular news. Nobody ever runs a headline saying the Brooklyn Bridge didn't fall down today. So it's not surprising, and it's entirely appropriate that we would keep attention on those sectors. And by the way, it's not just steel and aluminum. It includes autos, where there's a mixed bag of tariffs. It includes copper, nickel, now pharma is coming, and the latest ones, which I think are outrageous, are on kitchen cabinets and furniture, on the guise that they represent a national security threat to the United States of America. So I think Prime Minister Carney should remind President Trump that you need to have a little balance here. Otherwise, you're going to be the laughingstock of the world with some of the tariffs that you're putting on. He also will remind President Trump that this is probably the largest, most complex trading relationship in the world. It's almost evenly balanced. In fact, it's heavily in the U.S. favor because they receive our raw materials, which they turn into jobs. So they're well advantaged from this. Not only that, but we have a large defense security relationship with America. There's no other country in NORAD except Canada. There's no other place in the world where the United States would have less of a military presence than the U.S.-Canada border. So we've always had their back, and we will continue to be part of any security and security pact that is created. So I think we need to remind them of all of those important features of the relationship, which accrue to the very strong benefit of the United States of America.
Do you think just reminding them is enough? Because, you know, people look at this and they often say that U.S. President Donald Trump needs a win from this. So, you know, is it that he would finally admit that some of these things are actually benefiting the U.S., or do you think that Canada might be giving him something in exchange for what we might see on Monday?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. It's commonly thought that he needs to have bragging rights on anything that takes place, and that's a fair game. I don't think that we mind giving him those bragging rights. There are areas where he's going to win around security, for example, energy security, oil, gas. Some $70 billion in Canadian wealth has been transferred to the United States of America by giving them discounted oil. But we can put other things in the window. Critical minerals, something that are in large abundance within Canada, something that the United States needs. Uranium is a commodity which they really need, especially as they ramp up their nuclear program. And we can create right of first refusals or preferential treatment for the United States in some of those areas. And around defense, we're going to be increasing our defense spending almost 3 times, up to probably $150 to $160 billion a year by 2035. Right now, 75% of that to 85% is spent on kit from the United States of America. We can divert that. We can buy it from other places in the world, or we can commit to a continuing relationship with the United States of America. So we have a lot of tools at our disposal, and quite frankly, we can create a lot of pain points for the United States should they persist in wanting to declare economic war on us.
Just in closing, how important is it for Prime Minister Mark Carney to come back from this specific trip, his second down to the White House in 6 months, with a win, something that he can present to Canadians as proof that he has gotten something done?
I don't think it's important at all. Quite frankly, I think it would be a mistake to set that up as the litmus test of the trip. The fact that he's going to the White House, meeting with the president, the fact that they will once again have a chance to establish and reinforce their personal chemistry, that quite frankly is win enough. And if he can come back with some concessions in several areas in response to some concessions that Canada's made, I think that really represents bonus and gravy. But just the fact that the two leaders seem to respect each other and are talking, I think that's a win for our country.
Former Canadian Ambassador to the United States, Frank McKenna, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
So as you heard there, the former ambassador doesn't think that Carney needs to come home with some sort of a deal. What does our front bench think about that? We're going to dig into that a little later on in the show. We have Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Belanger, and Abigail Beeman. Time for a quick break. When we return, Western discord. Alberta and BC are at odds over a pipeline plan. Premier Danielle Smith wants her Western neighbour to get on board. But is that realistic? We'll ask BC Energy Minister Adrian Dix right after this.
If Alberta wants to be a proponent, they want to put the money forward to work as a proponent for a pipeline. That's their right to do so. They have said it will take them till the spring of next year before they have done enough work to come to us. They need to meet the 5 criteria we've laid out. They don't think they're ready to do that until next spring. When they bring it forward, like every other project, at that point, we'll take a look at what they're, where they are, and we'll evaluate it at that time.
And on the tanker ban?
It's a hypothetical question right now because there is no project before us.
That was the Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, Tim Hodgson, in Montreal this afternoon. He was taking questions from reporters for the first time since Alberta Premier Danielle Smith pitched a new pipeline. Her government plans to spend at least $14 million acting as the proponent for the first planning phase of a pipeline to northern BC. The premier of that province has rejected the plan, saying it's not really a project. Joining me now to talk more about this is BC's Energy Minister, Adrian Dix. Minister Dix, welcome back to Power Play.
Great to be on the show.
So I wanted to start with asking you about how both you and Premier Eby have downplayed whether or not Alberta's plan for a new pipeline will come to fruition. Because yesterday on this program, the CEO of Enbridge said that his company and others would be willing to be a proponent of a pipeline if the conditions are right. So doesn't that make it more of a real possibility than perhaps BC thinks it is?
Well, there's no proponent, right? Like we have dozens of major projects. We're presenting many to the federal government in the same process. There's proponents, there's plans, there's routes, there's business plans, and there's a huge hope for economic development in BC. In this case, no proponent, no route. It's a political venture, and nobody on this cost of pipeline is going to take take-or-pay contracts on this pipeline. The reality is that it is not yet, in any event, let's be fair, a serious proposal, and we've made that case, and we've said let's not distract from the critical proposals, the substantive proposals we're putting forward with this discussion. So that's part of significantly what we said further. Because some people think, well, is this a dispute between the provinces? Well, we've been working to support Alberta. Many of our major projects, we think of LNG, also are beneficial, significantly beneficial to Alberta, as everybody knows. The work we're doing and we want to do with Alberta on the intertie, which is beneficial to Alberta. In fact, we're supporting the federal government, supporting Alberta financially with some of those proposals. And further on oil, if we're talking about oil, there's significant capacity that's available at very low cost that is a fraction of what this massive venture, would it be put in place, costs. So it has significant costs. Further, we talked about lifting the tanker ban, which people are talking about on the North Coast. Well, it's in place. And it is one of the reasons, it's foundational to all of that economic development, including LNG, that's been happening on the North Coast. So for all these reasons, we've expressed the views we have, because this is a project that, for the most part, would be built in British Columbia. So that's the reason why we're expressing an opinion. If this was an Alberta project in Alberta, that would be a matter between Alberta and potentially the federal government.
So is the BC government 100% opposed to a bitumen pipeline if there was a private sector proponent that came forward with it?
So we just built a bitumen pipeline, right? TMX has built the existing pipeline.
But a new one, I guess, is what I'm saying.
No, but let's be clear. Of course, it wasn't built with private sector money. It was, we all own it. Everyone watching us today paid for it just a little bit, right? $34 billion. The majority of the debt carried by the federal government and not by the pipeline or its customers, right? That's what's happened, right? And so that has significantly increased by, in the 23-24 year, I think 300% the flow of the oil from Alberta to British Columbia, as you'd expect. And its principal customers right now are in China and the United States. And all of that is what's happened. So when people say, well, it's not happening or this isn't acceptable, that has happened. The issue here, at least for us, is that we have extraordinary opportunity in economic development in the province with real projects. And this, because it's divisive, because it's problematic, and because it's more of a political act than an economic act, for all of those reasons, we simply are expressing our strong view in favor of the oil tanker ban and in favor of investing in real projects in BC and supporting Alberta's interests in tangible ways, which we are doing.
But I guess I'm asking because Premier Smith wants this to be a real project, and she is putting Albertan money towards it and is saying that it won't be taxpayer funded and that it will be a private sector proponent coming forward to eventually build it. So that's why I'm asking you just clearly, are you against a new bitumen pipeline that could go to the northern coast or to the northwestern coast of BC?
But frankly, isn't it the responsibility of Alberta and Canada? If they're saying that this is not going to be public money, which the last one was, right, $34 billion in public money to be exact, to say what they're doing transparently. We're expressing our views about this because we think we have enormous opportunities for Canada here in critical minerals, in natural gas, in our ports, that this would significantly and negatively affect. So we're making our point for British Columbia. So we're standing up for BC's economy, which is the Canadian economy, will lead the Canadian economy in our view. And we're standing up, of course, for the coast of BC, which people have done for generations.
You said that this tanker ban is foundational to the tens of billions of dollars in investment being made in BC because removing it would affect these other projects. Can you give viewers a specific example of a project that could be affected by lifting the tanker ban?
All of these projects, right? We have social license on the North Coast, and not everyone agrees, by the way, but we have social license in the North Coast to build an LNG industry. $50 billion in projects under construction. That's no small thing. We'll talk about tens of billions. There's tens of billions. There are other projects, including LNG Canada 2, which is on the federal major project list, and obviously is a BC project, which is critically important. When we have support for those projects, and you just need to talk to the coastal First Nations specifically on this question. They were specific on this yesterday. And all the projects that have been supported in the region, many of which are beneficial to the provinces of BC and the province of Alberta and other provinces. This is part of what they've said, their social license for such projects, and that the tanker ban is foundational to that. And of course, the coast has its own significant economy that's important as well. This is not natural gas, this is oil, right? And so the risks are significantly, I mean significantly higher to that coast. So we're speaking for British Columbians, but we're also speaking for Canadians who I think see this economic development as real value and don't want to put it at risk. We have real projects. We could talk about, if we had enough time, we could talk about 24 of them, right? Investors will make a difference in critical minerals, in our economic sovereignty, in our ability to build the economy that we want to do. We want to build here. We just passed legislation to reduce the times of permitting and the times of process for major projects here in BC, Bills 14 and 15. We are building here. And we want to continue that drive with real projects and not have a debate that is essentially a theoretical debate. And I appreciate the views of people in the oil industry, but I would also say that they have been, I think, working with us, the oil and gas industry, on significant numbers of these projects. And they know, as I know, that Enbridge, and the president of Enbridge knows this, has significant potential extra capacity at low cost. The TMX has significant extra capacity at low cost. And so if that's the alternative, lower cost and less divisive, then that's a good alternative.
So you don't take Greg Ebel's point from yesterday where he said that Canada could be an energy superpower, but we are standing in the way of ourselves because of these things like the tanker ban and because of the cap on emissions, essentially saying that, you know, allow somebody to build that pipeline and they will get behind it. They are saying that they could be one of the proponents.
Well, with great respect, I have no issue with Enbridge. In fact, we've worked with them closely, including on projects in BC recently, extraordinary projects that they've done involving First Nations communities. So we have no issue with anyone. I'm just saying that they're not a proponent of this project. They're not. This is a fact. That the project itself would be extraordinarily expensive. Remember, the $34 billion project, that was a twinned line that TMX built. With great difficulty and with great challenge, but they got it built, right? $34 billion for twin line. This is a greenfield project across the north of BC that would be incredibly divisive. And our point is, we can do better than this as a country, and we're going to work with everybody, including the province of Alberta, to see that that happens. This is not our proposal. We're not on TV now because we're talking about BC's 20 or 25 proposals. We're talking about this one. And we're saying that when we submit projects to Ottawa, we have a higher standard, which is to have proponents, to have business plans, to have projects that will work and that will deliver wealth to our country. And that's what we need to do right now in the face of Mr. Trump's tariffs and the changing world environment. We need to diversify our markets. And that's exactly what we've been doing.
All right, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today, but I promise we'll have you back on, if you will come back on, to talk about those other projects in the future.
But Mike, as long as it doesn't affect your ratings, I'll come on anytime.
I'm sure they'll only go up. BC Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions, Adrian Dix, thanks for taking the time.
Anytime. Take care.
We've got one more quick break, and then we'll bring in our front bench on what's at stake for the Prime Minister's second trip to the White House in 6 months. Today we have Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Boulanger, and Abigail Beeman. Power Play. We'll be right back.
He met with the Americans, and after that meeting, they raised tariffs higher on Canadian lumber. He met with the British, and they said, no, they're not dropping the tariffs on Canadian beef. He's elbows up, elbows down. He's flying all around, and it's cost 86,000 Canadians their jobs. Everywhere he goes, things get worse.
We've signed landmark agreements in Europe. We've signed landmark agreements in Asia. We've gone to Mexico, signed landmark agreements with the administration there. This Prime Minister is active. He's out there building export markets. He's out there building opportunities for Canadians.
That was an exchange from the House of Commons today, where the Conservatives continue to question how much progress the Carney government has made in trade negotiations with the United States. Now, it comes as Prime Minister Mark Carney is preparing to head down to D.C. for more meetings with the American administration, including U.S. President Donald Trump. CTV News is reporting there could be movement on the steel and aluminum tariffs. So how important is it for Carney to get a win while in D.C.? Let's ask our front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now senior advisor at North Star Public Affairs. Melanie Paradis is former communications director to Erin O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. Former interim NDP national director Carl Boulanger is here. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And we have CTV national news correspondent Abigail Beeman, who has been reporting on this all day today. So, Abigail, let's start with you and what we're hearing ahead of this meeting, who the ministers are going there, and what the expectations are.
Well, Mike, there's a whole group of these key ministers that we've seen attached to this file for a while now. So we know that Dominic LeBlanc, of course, will be there, as well as Industry Minister Melanie Joly and Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand. One of the experts that I was speaking to on this file today described it this way, that the Canadian Embassy has been abuzz with meetings and invitations and as many people as possible working on this file, but that it's very notable that this is the moment that the Prime Minister has decided to come. And the hope or the expectation is that something, rather than just talk, will emerge from that. And what you referenced earlier is that CTV News is reporting that the Canadian side is expecting some progress specifically on steel and aluminum tariffs. And we heard that in your interview earlier with Mr. McKenna as well, reference to the pain that that's causing on the American side of this as well. So not expecting movement on autos, what one source is telling us, but potentially some movement on steel and aluminum.
Carl, how important is it for something to happen? And I say that, like, for Mark Carney to come back to Canada and to be able to say, this is what I was able to accomplish while I was down there.
Well, 100,000 jobs lost in the last 2 months. That's how important it is. And you can go and with a diversification strategy and travel the world and sign all the landmark agreements that you want. If they don't actually deliver anything in terms of jobs, it all goes back to the United States. And how can we sign a deal to try to mitigate some of the damage that has already been done? So that's why it's so important. And so what we're hearing is that, you know, he may target some sector and pick some winners, which means that eventually we will have also some losers. And that's where the concerns will grow in some sectors who are wondering what was going to happen to us.
Yeah, because there will be some that may not get that cutout, Melanie. So with any kind of relief, if there is some on steel and aluminum tariffs, will that buy him any kind of relief from opposition parties in the House of Commons?
Not until there's a good deal. That's what he promised Canadians in the election, and it's been months that we've been waiting to see actual, action, to see real progress towards that deal. There's just been a lot of talk. So the pressure keeps mounting every time there's a meeting like this. The pressure rises on Prime Minister Carney. I think that on Sunday, the premiers and the governors of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway are having their own summit, and they're going to have a press conference, I think, on Monday. Presumably, they're going to be calling for an increase in trade around that region, around the Great Lakes. They want to see trade diversification and trade, like more trade together, as opposed to this cooling that we've been seeing. So I'm sure that we're going to hear them calling for that, and that's only going to increase the pressure on Tuesday's meeting.
Sabrina, what realistically do you think Carney is looking at going into this and being able to deal with U.S. President Donald Trump? Because, I mean, as Abigail had said, CTV is reporting that there could be movement on steel and aluminum, but that's Friday. As of Friday, we're hearing that, and we know that a lot can change over a weekend, in 24 hours, frankly, with U.S. President Donald Trump. So how important is it, though, for Carney to go into this and to try and nail something down and to really sort of also come back and present it to Canadians so that then when they see it, that they say, okay, we understand that things are actually progressing here, instead of this just being a check-in?
Yeah, I mean, I think from one aspect, I would say Mark Carney's done a very good job at relationship building with Donald Trump. Going to the U.S. a second time, I think being open to that possibility and putting some of these conversations actually in person, as opposed to perhaps using your subsidiaries like ministers instead of actually being there yourself. So I think he's doing the right things when it comes to building those relationships. I think it's really hard to still predict where the United States is going to come out on all of this, and if they're even interested in negotiating on a deal today, or if they do want to wait until closer to 2026, closer to CUSMA, closer to the midterms. And I say that because, as late as last week, you still saw Ambassador Hoekstra, positioning threats to Canada, right? Saying, well, maybe the pre-clearance will close because at Canadian airports on getting into the United States, because we're just not flying there enough anymore. And so they continue to kind of fall back on these like threats and these weird niches. And so I think it's really hard to say, does the United States want a deal right now? And so I think that's why you haven't seen the expectations be set by Mark Carney and the team.
Yeah, and Abigail, when you consider, what NAFTA 1.0 was in the negotiations, I mean, this is very, very different. A lot of the negotiations are not happening in public. I mean, I remember, and we covered it, you had Chrystia Freeland on the steps of United States Trade Representative giving press conferences. We're not hearing any of that.
Yeah, it would come out very frequently. And I made a point of that in my story today. It took some reporters yelling at the Prime Minister, "Have you spoken to Trump?" And then he turns around and says yes, and that's the first we've heard of a conversation, right? We aren't getting these readouts or even indications at a very basic level that the two sides are talking. But the overall message that we're getting is that they are. And we saw LeBlanc's testimony at the Senate committee this week, giving some indications that he felt that there is not only progress, but the ability to get some kind of a sectoral tariff deal separate from CUSMA, and that the CUSMA talks about a relaunch of CUSMA have been productive so far. So we'll see, what bears out. Those are the signals, but we're not getting very many of them.
Yeah, and Carl, how important is it to signal to the Canadian public so that they understand and they're reassured versus just getting the work done and making sure you're getting a good deal?
Well, yeah, I mean, you can signal, and that's part of the travel agenda of the Prime Minister, is that he's doing something, he's doing things. So for now, he's not paying a heavy political price for the fact that he has not solved the trade war yet.
Right.
But soon enough, he will have to show results, and those results can come with a deal, any kind of deal that benefit Canada and not only the United States.
Yeah. Okay. We're going to take a quick break with this panel. We're going to be right back and talk about province versus province on pipelines, of all things. Well, we've been talking about it a lot, and we're going to talk about it a little more right after this.
I don't think you have to look too far to see concrete, real examples of Enbridge and other pipelines being willing to be the proponent of a pipeline if the conditions are set. Capital will go to where the conditions are set, and today the conditions are not set for that pipeline to exist in Canada.
If Alberta wants to be a proponent, they want to put the money forward to work as a proponent for a pipeline, that's their right to do so. They need to meet the 5 criteria we've laid out.
And on the tanker ban?
It's a hypothetical question right now because there is no project before us.
This week, pipeline politics have been fueling, see what we did there? Political chatter here in Ottawa and across the country. First, Alberta Premier Danielle Smith said her province will be the initial proponent for a new pipeline from Alberta to the BC coast. Then, in a broadcast exclusive interview that you just saw with Enbridge's CEO yesterday, right here on Power Play, Greg Ebel made it clear current conditions don't exist for a company like his to back a new pipeline project. Among other things, he wants to see Ottawa's tanker ban to be lifted. but provinces like BC are strongly opposed. All of this as the Liberal government is set to announce the next phase of major projects that it will back next month. So what's at stake for the federal government? Let's bring back the front bench. Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Belanger, and Abigail Beeman. Sabrina, what is at stake for the federal government here? Because it feels like this is a bit of a showdown where Mark Carney tried to lay the groundwork and say, okay, if there's a proponent, let them come forward. And then Danielle Smith said, well, I see your challenge and I raise you myself as the proponent.
Right. And raising herself as a proponent is not a real project. If Danielle Smith was serious about this, then the people you would see at the table wouldn't be 3 private sector companies who we kind of already know what their, their table stakes are. It would also include the province of BC and First Nations, who are the real challengers in getting a pipeline project built. That, I would say, would be, signals that Danielle Smith actually wants to build a pipeline project, a successful pipeline project, and not just poke Mark Carney in the eye. But let me take this a step further, right? So, yes, we saw the Enbridge CEO yesterday kind of dance around the fact that maybe if the conditions were right, maybe they'd be a proponent, maybe they'd come to the table. But as late as last month, you saw the CEO of TransCanada say that there is ample space in the current pipeline industry to guide us to 2030. That's 5 years before we think that there's even need for a potential pipeline to come on board. And no one, including TransCanada, Enbridge, has come to the table with money. And that's because the pipeline project isn't viable at this time. And it's not just going to be viable because Danielle Smith put $14 million behind it and said, we should come up with a report on this.
Yeah, and Carl, what I find is interesting as well is where David Eby is on this, because I mean it's clear what he wants or doesn't want, but also the fact that he will be facing a leadership review shortly, and it almost feels like he is trying to sort of really dig in here.
Of course, and it's an easy issue to dig in because there's a lot of popular support behind his position in BC.
Yeah.
So inside his party, but across the province, they don't want that pipeline, and there's no business case for it at this point. And this is what happens when pipeline become an ideology, and that's what it became for Danielle Smith. It's an ideology, so much so that she painted herself in a corner. What if it doesn't happen? Well, she raises the specter of separatism again. Mm-hmm. National unity was linked to this project. How so? It makes no sense, but she is raising the stakes in that way, painting herself in a corner, and we're going to be put in a position where it's going to be very dangerous for this country in the near future if this doesn't happen.
Yeah, Melanie, do you feel like Danielle Smith, as Carl just said, has really put herself on the ledge here? Because her saying that this is a test of Canada as a country really does sort of lean into that separatist sentiment that we know that she's dealing with out there, out west. But what position does that put Smith in if, after all of this, after $14 million of Albertans' money, that she realizes that there is nobody that will actually go forward with this? Or is she just trying to put the federal government on notice and say, well, look, you have to deal with the tanker ban and everything else that these energy companies want to get rid of?
Yeah, and they do. Like, she's right to do that. She is right to raise this issue and to try to demonstrate how difficult it's going to be to advance a project. There's a reason why none of the oil and gas companies are saying, yeah, we want to build a pipeline right now. It's not that they don't want to. It's not that there isn't a tremendous amount of demand for Canadian oil and gas products. The world wants our oil and gas. The problem is we can't get it to them because the conditions on the ground are such that our regulatory environment is prohibitive. Mark Carney, during his campaign, said, build, baby, build. That's what he wants to do. But in order to actually achieve that vision, it's going to require a considerable amount of regulatory changes. That's also going to include lifting the tanker ban. And it's going to require provinces that have historically not wanted to have oil and gas projects on their land. They're going to have to think about it differently. We've seen a tone shift from Quebec. BC should probably do some soul searching about this too. We need to be able to get our products to market. We cannot keep relying on north-south pipelines.
Yeah, and it's interesting, Abigail, because Smith also put a bit of a deadline on this. She said, look, I want to see this in the next tranche, which is supposed to be announced before the Grey Cup, even though her study is only basically going to finish in May of 2026. What do you think is going to be the sort of showdown here between the feds and Danielle Smith's government?
So I'll tell you what I keep reflecting on as this story has unfolded, and it was being in Edmonton when that first list of major projects was released, being in Edmonton when Premier Smith sat down with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the glowing reports that she gave, comparatively speaking, in both those cases. So after her meeting with the Prime Minister, everything was great, and then after that list of major projects where there was no oil pipeline on there and no Alberta project in that first 5, Pathways was in the 10, and she had no problems with it. And I'm still thinking to this day, to be a fly on the wall in that meeting, what was promised or what was said or what was on the table before that Grey Cup, which is also the deadline that the Prime Minister said. They wouldn't even let us, get a picture of the two going in or coming out or meeting. It was, as far hands off in terms of pictures, kept under wraps. And that's the meeting that I'm still thinking about today and wondering what was on the table.
Yeah, and Carl, you wonder, what was that conversation like? What did Mark Carney say to Danielle Smith that made her feel good and that made her go to this position? Is there something that maybe she knows that we don't know yet?
Well, she's trying to push the issue. Maybe she saw an opening in Mark Carney's position, and now it's up to him not to fumble that ball before the Grey Cup. You see what I did there?
Yeah, I see what you did there.
But the issue, though, is that do we actually need this, and in what timeline? Because we're talking about Trans Mountain. It's used, 75 to 80% capacity right now. There's still some room there. And with the world going down the electrification route, how much oil and gas will we need in the future to invest that much money, make sure we're going to get our money back as taxpayers? That's the issue, because right now, the money we spent on the other pipeline projects, I'm not sure Canadian taxpayers got a bang for their buck. Oil and gas companies sure did, but taxpayers, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, Melanie, is it just easy for Pierre Poilievre to sort of sit back and let this play out and let everybody else fight and not really get into it?
Sorry, I just can't get over the notion that we're not going to need more oil and gas, and then in a couple of years, everyone's just going to be electrified and we're not going to need it anymore. I mean, Carl, your tie is probably made of oil and gas. It's in everything. The world needs Canadian oil. It's in every synthetic fiber. It's in plastics. It's not something that we can just say, oh, we're going to be able to turn this off in 5 years. And when pipelines are nearing their maximum, or when they're at 80%, you shouldn't wait until they're at 100% to start building more pipelines. They take a long time. As we've demonstrated in this country, it takes 15 years to open a mine, never mind build a pipeline. We need to change that. We've got to get our regulations in check here. Mark Carney has a lot of work to do on a regulatory environment if he wants to build, baby build.
Sabrina, you got the last 15 seconds.
Well, this is my most Albertan thing that I'll say, but it's, you can say oil and gas, but there is room for a gas pipeline. There may just not be room for an oil pipeline, and those are two different things. And I think that that's the realization that, Danielle Smith will come to, and might be the realization that a lot of these companies come to. And I agree that we can be an energy superpower, but remember that just last year, Danielle Smith drove away $33 billion in clean energy investments in this province. So there's lots of different ways to make this case to be an energy superpower, and oil pipeline is not the be-all, end-all of it.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it right there. Sabrina Grover, Melanie Paradis, Carl Boulanger, and Abigail Beeman. Appreciate you being on the front bench. I'm going to check Carl's label and what is in his tie as he leaves. But we have some breaking news for you just this hour. Marineland has written to the government responding to an earlier decision by the federal government this week to deny export permits to move the defunct park's remaining 30 beluga whales to an amusement park in China. The park is asking the federal government for emergency funds and assistance relocating the whales, writing in part, "We're fully indebted and rapidly running out of resources to provide adequate care for the whales." Going on to say our only options at this point are to either relocate the whales or face the devastating decision of euthanasia. In this context, we must ask whether the federal government is prepared to provide immediate operating funding for ongoing whale care until a suitable relocation can be arranged in accordance with the minister's conditions. Well, coming up here on Power Play, we have an update for you on a story CTV News first brought you about a new federal government policy that was limiting the providing of Remembrance release to MPs to just 2. More on that after a short break. We've got an update to a story CTV News first brought you earlier this week. Just a few days ago, Veterans Affairs Minister Jill McKnight sent a note to MPs saying the government would only provide 2 wreaths to MPs to display at Remembrance Day events in their ridings. And if they wanted more, the MP would have to pay for them. But now the feds are backtracking. CTV's Abigail Beeman has been following this story for us and joins us with the latest. What's changed?
Well, I think for context, important to point out, because some people might hear 2 wreaths and say, how many wreaths do you need at an event? But really, this is of most import, I think, for MPs who have rural riding. So large areas where I'm told that it could take up to 24 wreaths to hit every cenotaph, ceremony, school event over the course of Veterans Week and Remembrance Day. So when this email that we obtained went out to MPs, there was some concern about what would happen. We reported on this story on Wednesday. Today in the House, a Conservative MP asked the minister about that and why this was the case, and I'll let you listen to her response.
Many ridings have dozens of cenotaphs that request wreaths for Remembrance Day. The Liberals are now telling MPs that VAC will only pay for 2. Veterans Affairs uses the tag Canada Remembers on social media. So why now is the Liberal government choosing to forget our veterans?
On learning that the changes could significantly disruptive to the Remembrance Day, I've instructed my department to revert to the previous format for this year. This Veterans Week, I encourage all Canadians to support their local legions and support the work our veterans have done for this country.
So you can sort of hear it there, but there was applause on both sides of the House to that announcement that basically this decision would be reversed and last year's policy would apply. Now, I asked a number of follow-up questions. Why was the decision reversed? What happens for the years after? Is there a conversation ongoing there? None of my questions were answered. I was just pointed to a very similar statement that the minister put on Twitter. And I'll note, because you heard that clip from MP Alex Ruff, that he is, in addition to being a Conservative MP in a rural riding, he is himself a veteran as well.
Yeah, and it's great news that has happened and great reporting on this, Abigail. Really appreciate you bringing that to us. That is your Power Play Week in Politics. I'm Mike Lucutura. Thanks so much for spending your time with us. Have yourselves a great weekend and stay tuned to CTV News Channel because your top headlines are just ahead.